Think the beach is just sun, sand, and relaxation? Think again. Beaches may look like paradise, but beneath the surface, there's a darkness waiting to pull you under. Every year, countless lives are lost to the hidden dangers of the shore. If you've ever felt the allure of the ocean, beware, because after hearing these stories, you might never look at the beach the same way again. Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're delving into the eerie and terrifying side of the beach, where peaceful waves can turn deadly in an instant. So grab your snacks, sit tight, and prepare to uncover the chilling secrets that lurk in the shadows of the shore. It was the summer of 2022 when my friends and I decided to take a weekend trip to a remote beach we'd heard about from a local fisherman. The beach was known as Clearwater Cove, a secluded spot far from the usual tourist destinations. The fisherman had warned us about the strong currents and unpredictable tides, but we were drawn to the idea of having a private beach all to ourselves. We arrived early in the morning, the sun barely rising above the horizon. The beach was breathtaking, white sand stretching for miles, with crystal clear waters that sparkled under the sun. We set up our camp near a cluster of large rocks at the far end of the cove, excited for a day of swimming and relaxation. As the day went on, the beach remained eerily quiet. There were no other people in sight, and the only sounds were the gentle lapping of waves and the occasional cry of seagulls. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, but we didn't think much of it at the time. We spent hours swimming, exploring the rocky outcrops and soaking up the sun. By late afternoon, the tide began to rise, and we decided to take a break. As we sat on our towels, talking and laughing, something caught my eye, a figure in the distance, walking along the shore. At first, I thought it was another beachgoer, but as the figure drew closer, I realized something was off. The person was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, completely soaked through, as if they had just emerged from the sea. Their skin was pale and waterlogged, and their movements were slow and jerky, like they were struggling to walk. I nudged my friend, pointing out the figure, and we all watched in silence as they approached. When the person was only a few yards away, I could see their face clearly. A young man, probably in his early 20s, with sunken eyes and an expression of utter despair. He didn't say a word, just stared at us with a haunting intensity. It felt like he was trying to communicate something, but we couldn't understand what. One of my friends, concerned, stood up and called out to him, asking if he needed help. The man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly turned and began walking back toward the water. We watched in stunned silence as he waded into the waves, disappearing beneath the surface without so much as a splash. We were shaken, unsure of what we had just witnessed. My friends debated whether we should call for help or search the area, but the beach was deserted, and there was no sign of the man. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. As the sun began to set, we decided to pack up and leave. The atmosphere had shifted, and the once beautiful beach now felt cold and foreboding. On our way back to the car, we ran into the same fisherman who had recommended the beach. We told him about the strange encounter, expecting him to laugh it off or dismiss it as our imagination. Instead, his face grew serious. He told us that many years ago, a young man had drowned in that very cove, swept away by the powerful currents. The man's body was never recovered, and some locals believed that his restless spirit still roamed the beach, searching for help that would never come. The fisherman's story sent chills down our spines. We had no way of knowing if what we saw was truly the ghost of the drowned man, but none of us were willing to return to Clearwater Cove to find out. To this day, I can't shake the image of that pale, waterlogged figure and the empty, despairing look in his eyes. Whenever I think about that day, I'm filled with a sense of dread, wondering if the beach we once saw as paradise is really a place where lost souls are trapped, forever reliving their final moments. It was the last night of our summer vacation, and my friends and I decided to celebrate with a bonfire on a secluded beach we had discovered earlier that week. The beach, known as Shadow Bay, was a hidden gem, far from the crowded tourist spots and accessible only by a narrow, winding path through the woods. It was the perfect place to unwind, surrounded by nothing but the sound of crashing waves and the glow of the fire. We arrived just as the sun was setting, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. The beach was deserted as we expected, and we quickly set up our bonfire, gathering driftwood and rocks to contain the flames. As the fire roared to life, we settled in for a night of stories, laughter, and a few drinks. The night was perfect. Clear skies, a gentle breeze, and the warmth of the fire keeping the chill at bay. We shared ghost stories, trying to outdo each other with tales of hauntings and supernatural encounters. The darkness seemed to close in around us, making the stories feel all the more real. It was around midnight when the atmosphere shifted. The wind picked up, blowing sand across the beach, and the once calm waves began to crash more violently against the shore. We tried to ignore it, but there was an undeniable tension in the air, as if the beach itself was trying to warn us of something. That's when we noticed it, a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the firelight, just beyond the circle of warmth. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long limbs that seemed to stretch and contort in the flickering light. At first, we thought it was a trick of the flames, but as we stared, the figure remained, unmoving and watching. A nervous laugh escaped from one of my friends as they tried to brush it off as someone playing a prank. But there was no one else on the beach. The path we had taken was narrow and treacherous, and we would have heard anyone approaching. The figure stayed at the edge of the light, just close enough for us to see its outline but not its features. It was as if it was made of darkness itself, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. We tried calling out to it, but there was no response. It simply stood there, silently observing us. As the minutes ticked by, the tension grew unbearable. The fire, which had been blazing brightly, suddenly began to die down, the flames shrinking despite the abundance of wood. The shadows around us deepened, and the figure seemed to grow larger, more menacing. Panic set in. We scrambled to our feet, dousing the fire with sand in a desperate attempt to leave. As the flames were extinguished, the figure vanished, swallowed by the darkness. But the sense of being watched didn't disappear. It intensified. We grabbed our things and hurried back up the path, the wind howling through the trees. The darkness felt oppressive, as if it was closing in around us, and the once familiar path seemed longer and more treacherous than before. Every rustle in the bushes, every crack of a branch made us jump, convinced that the figure was following us. When we finally reached the safety of our cars, we piled in and sped away from Shadow Bay, not daring to look back. The drive back to our hotel was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to process what we had just experienced. The next morning, we decided to ask the locals about the beach. They told us that Shadow Bay had a dark history. Decades ago, it had been the site of a tragic accident. A group of campers had gone missing, their bodies never found. Since then, the beach had been shunned, with stories of strange sightings and unexplained phenomena driving people away. We never returned to Shadow Bay, and we've never spoken of that night again. But sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I can still feel the weight of that shadowy figure's gaze, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting souls to wander too close to its territory. Last summer, I decided to take a solo camping trip to a remote beach known as Whispering Sands. It was a place I'd read about in a travel blog, praised for its untouched beauty and crystal-clear waters. The beach was far off the beaten path, accessible only by a long hike through dense forest. I was eager for some solitude, so the idea of spending a few days there sounded perfect. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun beginning to dip toward the horizon. The beach was everything the blog had promised, pristine, quiet, and isolated. I set up my tent just above the high tide line, laid out my gear, and then spent the remaining daylight hours exploring the coastline. The air was warm, and the sound of the waves crashing gently against the shore was soothing. I felt at peace. As night fell, I built a small fire and cooked dinner, enjoying the simple pleasure of being alone in nature. The sky was clear, and the stars above seemed brighter than I'd ever seen. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the rhythmic sound of the ocean. But as the night deepened, I began to notice something strange. The waves, which had been gentle all evening, began to change. It wasn't that they grew stronger, they were still the same gentle roll of water against the sand, but they started to sound different, almost like they were whispering. At first I thought it was just the wind, but there was something distinctly human about the sound, like faint voices carried on the breeze. I strained to listen, trying to make out the words, but they were too faint, too distorted by the crashing of the waves. Yet the longer I listened, the more unnerved I became. It was as if the ocean itself was trying to speak to me, or perhaps to warn me. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But the whispers continued, growing slightly louder with each passing hour. Uneasy, I decided to turn in for the night. I doused the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped it up tight. But the whispers followed me inside, seeping through the canvas walls like a persistent breeze. They were louder now, though still unintelligible, a chorus of overlapping voices just beyond comprehension. Sleep was impossible. I lay there, heart pounding, as the whispers surrounded me, pressing in from all sides. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence was so abrupt and complete that it was almost more unsettling than the voices had been. For a moment I thought it was over, that whatever had been causing the whispers had finally left. But then I heard it, a single clear voice close to my ear, almost inside my head. It was a woman's voice, soft and sad, whispering a single word. "Run." I bolted upright, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was gone, replaced by the sound of the waves crashing against the shore, but the message was clear. I scrambled out of my tent, flashlight in hand, and scanned the beach. There was nothing there, no figures, no movement, just the empty stretch of sand and the endless ocean. But the feeling of dread was overwhelming, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I didn't wait to find out what the warning meant. I hastily packed up my gear, leaving the tent behind in my haste, and began the long hike back to my car. The forest path was pitch black, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sent my heart racing. The whispers had stopped, but the memory of that voice lingered, urging me to move faster. I reached my car just as the first light of dawn began to break. I threw my gear into the back seat and drove away, not daring to look back. It wasn't until I was miles away from the beach that I finally began to calm down. Later, I learned that Whispering Sands had a tragic history. Decades ago, a ship had wrecked just off the coast, and many of the crew had drowned. Their bodies never recovered. Locals believed that the spirits of the lost sailors haunted the beach, their voices carried on the tide, forever whispering to anyone who dared to camp there. I don't know if what I heard that night was truly the voices of the drowned, but I do know that I won't be returning to Whispering Sands. The beach may be beautiful, but it's a beauty tainted by a darkness that still lingers in the whispers of the tide.